In the pages of ancient history, victory does not always go to the strongest, the most numerous, or the richest. Every now and then, history witnesses the seemingly impossible when a small group of flesh and blood, with primitive weapons and an unshakable will, dare to stand up to the overwhelming might of the world's greatest empires. Those battles endure for thousands of years, not only because of the results, but because of the spirit, the courage, and the immortal message they leave behind for posterity. Close your eyes and imagine. A lone warrior, his face tanned, sweat beading on his forehead, his eyes straining towards the horizon. There, a sea of people is approaching, thousands, tens of thousands of enemies, filling the horizon like a black tidal wave. His unit's flag flutters in the wind, but is tattered after days of relentless fighting. Behind him, there were only a few hundred of his comrades, familiar faces who had fought side by side since the beginning. Before him, it was not a battle that could be won, but almost certain death. But at that moment, the fear disappeared. In his mind, there was only one question: stand firm or fall. In human history, there were moments when the balance of power tilted to one side. On one side were huge armies with overwhelming logistics, weapons, and numbers. On the other, only small, few, even deprived groups. But it was those who were considered weak, when pushed to the wall, that became more dangerous and resilient than any military power. This video will take you through the pages of history stained with blood, but shining with the indomitable spirit of humanity. From the narrow pass of Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans fought against a sea of Persians. Masada, where Jews chose death over chains. The fields of Gaugamela, where Alexander the Great brought down an empire. Cannae, Salamis, and Teutoburg, each a testament to the fact that history is not written by numbers alone, but by will and intelligence. And when you have heard this story, perhaps you will realize, in any era, even when everything is against you, there is a path to immortality. 2. The Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans against a sea of Persis. In 480 BC, a storm was brewing in Greece. The Persian Empire, led by Xerxes the Varch, a king who had ambitions of making the entire Western world his domain. His army, according to Greek records, numbered hundreds of thousands, even more than 1 million, including foot soldiers, cavalry, archers, and even warriors from distant Persian lands. They advanced like a tidal wave, swallowing up every small city-state in their path. Greece was a divided land, dozens of independent city-states constantly at odds and rarely agreeing. Faced with a common threat, many hesitated, some chose to submit to avoid being slaughtered. But in the midst of the chaos, one man stepped forward, Leonidas, king of Sparta, where fighting is instinct, victory is duty, and death on the battlefield is the ultimate glory. Leonidas understood that to stop the Persian advance, he needed a strategic location where numbers could not exert their full power. He chose Thermopylae, the Hot Gate, a narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea, where just a few hundred men could block a large army. The plan was clear: to hold off the Persians for as long as possible, giving the remaining Greek city-states time to prepare their defenses. Along with 300 of Sparta's best warriors, men who had been trained from birth in a harsh environment where sacrifice was a given, Leonidas had several thousand allied soldiers from other city-states. They knew they could not survive, but they still left as if they were entering a festival. On the morning of the first day of the battle, the dawn turned the sea red. The light reflected on thousands of spears and bronze shields. From afar, the sound of war drums and the sound of horse hooves shook the ground. The first waves of Persian troops rushed in like a raging wave. The Spartan shields were tightly closed, spears were pointed like a forest of steel, arrows covered the sky, falling like black rain. But the Greek formation remained as solid as a stone wall, repelling each attack, turning the narrow passage into a place where the enemy had to pay in blood for every step forward. On the second day, Xerxes sent his most elite units into the battlefield, the Immortals. But even they were stopped. Every attack was repelled. Every gap was filled with shields and spears. Leonidas and his soldiers fought with perfect coordination, taking advantage of the terrain to turn their small numbers into an advantage. On the third day, tragedy struck. A Greek named Ephialtes betrayed him and led the Persians around the mountain path to attack from behind. When he heard the news, Leonidas knew the battle was over. He ordered most of his allies to retreat, leaving behind only 300 Spartans, along with a few hundred Thespaean and Theban soldiers who had volunteered to stay. The final battle took place under the blazing sun. With no solid defenses left, they charged at the enemy with all their remaining strength, fighting with swords, then broken spears, then bare hands. When Leonidas fell, the remaining warriors built a fence around his body, fighting until arrows and swords ended everything. Their deaths were not defeats. They were the spark that ignited the spirit of resistance of all Greece, leading to the great victory over Persia later. Thermopylae has since become the immortal symbol of the saying, "The Spartans do not ask how many enemies they have, but where they are." The siege of Masada. Better death than slavery. In 73 AD, Judea was engulfed in flames. The Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire had lasted for years, but now the mighty might of Rome had all but crushed any resistance. Jerusalem, the heart of the Jewish people, had fallen. The temple had been destroyed. Thousands had been killed or enslaved. Only a small group of about 960 men, women, and children had retreated to an isolated fortress in the middle of the desert. Masada. Masada was unlike any other citadel. It sat atop a massive rocky plateau, surrounded by nearly vertical cliffs hundreds of meters high, making access from below almost impossible. At the top, the fortress had a fortified wall, a supply depot, and a system of cisterns built by King Herod decades earlier. This was the last place of freedom, where they hoped to withstand the Roman storm. But the Romans would not give up so easily. Under the command of General Flavius Silva, some 15,000 men, including regular soldiers and slave laborers, advanced to Masada. Instead of attacking head-on, they set up a siege camp on all sides, cutting off all supply lines, and began a patient but ruthless plan, building a giant ramp that led straight up to the walls. Picture the scene. Under the scorching desert sun, hordes of slaves and soldiers hauling rocks, dumping dirt, and building layer upon layer. Each day, the ramp drew closer to the fortress. From above, Jews threw stones and shot arrows to block it. Arrows stuck in shields, and stones shattered when they hit helmets. But the Romans kept advancing piece by piece, undeterred. Months passed. In the fortress, the Jews knew when the road was completed, when the Romans swept in, they would have no chance. They had heard of the fate of other places. Men killed, women and children taken as slaves, transported throughout the provinces of the empire. For them, life was no longer life. And then, on the eve of the Roman assault, they gathered. According to the historian Josephus, who witnessed the event, a decision was made. They would not let themselves fall into the hands of the enemy. Torches burned in the desert night. Men hugged their wives and children for the last time. They shed tears, but did not tremble. They would rather let their loved ones go in peace than be humiliated into slavery. Small groups were chosen to carry out this act, an act of cruelty, but also the height of desperate resilience. When all was said and done, the last of the men took their own lives. The next morning, when the Romans entered Masada, ready for a massacre, they were met with silence. There was no one left alive in the fortress. All 960 had chosen death. From that day on, Masada became an eternal symbol of freedom and steadfastness. For today's Israelis, the words "Masada will never fall again" are more than a slogan. They are an oath engraved in the flesh and blood of an entire nation. The Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander the Great and the Gamble of Destiny. In 331 BC, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers was shaken by news. Darius III, Emperor of Persia, was assembling the largest force in the history of the empire to confront a foreigner, Alexander of Macedon. Darius had lost to Alexander once at Issus, but this time he vowed to crush the invader. On the vast plain near Gaugamela, a flat field that was well suited to cavalry and chariots, hundreds of thousands of Persians had set up camp. Ancient historians estimated the number at 200,000, along with thousands of armored cavalry and hundreds of chariots with iron sickles on their wheels, ready to tear through the enemy ranks. Alexander, meanwhile, had only about 47,000 men, less than a quarter of Darius's force. But he had something the Persians lacked: a brilliant strategic mind and the absolute trust of his men. The night before the battle, the Macedonian camp was quiet. Alexander slept soundly, forcing his generals to wake him at dawn. When Parmenion asked him why he was so calm before the decisive battle, Alexander simply smiled. "Because we have already won. All that remains is to go out and take the victory." The next dawn, the two armies lined up. Darius stood in his gilded chariot, surrounded by his elite guards. Alexander rode Bucephalus, his own horse since childhood, on the right flank, where he planned to deliver the decisive blow. As the trumpet sounded, the ground shook beneath his horse's hooves and the iron wheels crunched. The Persian cavalry charged, the chariots charging like a storm, but the Macedonian spear line opened up, creating a gap for the chariots to pass through and be instantly defeated. Alexander did not attack head-on. He gradually shifted his formation to the right, as if trying to avoid confrontation, forcing the Persian cavalry to spread out and surround them. It was a trap. When the gap appeared in the center of the Persian line, Alexander shouted, leading his elite companion cavalry straight into the heart of the enemy formation, a steel arrow that pierced the vast army like a sea of people. Darius saw the danger of being captured. In panic, he abandoned his chariot, jumped on his horse, and fled. Like dominoes, the Persian army fell. When the dust settled, Alexander had not only won, he had shattered the power of an empire that had ruled from Egypt to India. The road to Persia was open, and from there he became Alexander the Great, a man who would be remembered by both East and West. The Battle of Gaugamela was more than a military victory. It was a demonstration that the strategy, daring, and conviction of a small army could defeat overwhelming power if led by a genius. Stalingrad. When hell is named a city. In the summer of 1942, the skies over eastern Russia were red with the smoke of war. Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the second phase, with a key goal: to capture Stalingrad, the city named after his number one enemy, Joseph Stalin. Stalingrad was not only a strategic traffic point on the banks of the Volga River, but also a spiritual symbol of the Soviet Union. If it fell, the whole country could be shaken. The Germans advanced like a storm. Thousands of tons of bombs dropped on the city, turning it into rubble. But that very rubble became a natural fortress for the defenders. Every building, every basement, every wall was turned into a trench. In the bitter cold of the Russian winter, fighting took place on every inch of land. The Germans called it the War of Rats, because both sides had to crawl, and weave through the rubble to kill each other. During the day, German soldiers might take a factory. At night, the Red Army would take it back. Blood stained the icebergs on the Volga. But Hitler did not back down. He ordered General Paulus's Sixth Army to take Stalingrad at all costs. Stalin gave the same ironclad order, not a step back. Both leaders turned the city into a living symbol and a giant graveyard. The turning point came in November 1942. The Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a surprise counterattack, attacking the weaker German flanks to the north and south of the city. Within days, they had closed the encirclement, cutting off the Sixth Army from its supply lines. The harsh winter tightened the encirclement like a death grip. Food ran out, ammunition dwindled, and wounded froze to death in their bunkers. The German soldiers ate horse meat, then their skins and belts to survive. Paulus asked for permission to retreat, but Hitler replied, "No retreat. You must fight to the last man." On January 31, 1943, Paulus surrendered, becoming the first German field marshal to be captured alive. Only about 90,000 German soldiers survived to enter the POW camp, and very few returned home. Stalingrad changed the course of World War II. After this defeat, the Germans never regained the initiative on the Eastern Front. The ruined city still stood, and the name Stalingrad forever became a symbol of incredible resilience. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the 56-day war that shocked the world. In the winter of 1953, the northwest region of Vietnam was cold and wet, with clouds and mist covering the rolling mountains. In a valley called Dien Bien Phu, the French army began building a set of fortified strongholds, considered an impregnable fortress. With strong firepower, a supply airport, and thousands of elite soldiers, they believed that this would be an iron trap that would crush the Vietnam People's Army. But on the other side, General Vo Nguyen Giap did not see a fortress, but a caged beast. He secretly implemented a daring plan, transporting hundreds of large artillery pieces across rugged mountains and forests, digging dozens of kilometers of siege trenches, gradually tightening the ring of fire around the valley. On March 13, 1954, the sky over Dien Bien shook. The Viet Minh artillery thundered down on the strongholds. The 105-millimeter guns, which seemed impossible to find in this harsh terrain, appeared at the right time and place. The Him Lam stronghold collapsed after only a few hours of fighting, and that was only the beginning. For 56 days and nights, the war unfolded like a never-ending nightmare for the French. The trenches crept closer to each bunker, shrinking by a circle each day. Paratroopers, foreign legionnaires, North African soldiers, all were caught up in the desperate battle. The spring rain turned the ground into mud, turning the wounded into shivering bodies in flooded pits. General de Castries repeatedly sent out distress calls, but all attempts at reinforcements failed. Supply planes were shot down or forced to drop their cargo into enemy hands. Meanwhile, each defensive position was captured by the Viet Minh like torn pieces of fabric. On May 7, 1954, the last shots rang out. The Kiet Shen Kiet Thang flag flew over De Castries' command bunker. More than 16,000 French troops were killed or captured. A colonial empire that had ruled Indochina for more than 80 years had officially collapsed. Dien Bien Phu was not only a military victory, but also a global political shock. For the first time in the 20th century, a colonial force had defeated the army of a Western power in a large-scale battle. From Asia to Africa, the echoes of this victory fueled national liberation movements around the world. And in Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu became living proof that human will, when tempered to the utmost, can accomplish seemingly impossible things. War ends, but its echoes never go away. Fallen walls can be rebuilt, broken bridges can be rebuilt, but the wounds in the soul, both of the victors and the vanquished, take decades, even a lifetime, to heal. From ancient Athens after the Peloponnesian War, to French villages after World War I, to Vietnamese cities after Dien Bien Phu, the pain and memories of war still permeate every story, every look. Soldiers return not the same. Mothers still wait for children who never returned. However, amid the ashes, there is always a seed of hope. Military science, although born from the need to destroy, leaves behind lessons in technique, tactics, and organization, things that can be applied to protect and develop peace. International treaties, though belated, remind humanity of the value of law and humanity in conflict. But the greatest legacy of war is not in textbooks or museums. It is in the collective memory of humanity, a reminder that true power is not the ability to destroy, but the ability to restrain. That sometimes the greatest victories are those achieved without firing a shot. And that is the red thread that connects all the stories we have just gone through. From Thermopylae to Dien Bien Phu, from mighty empires to small nations, history proves that the greatest battles are always fought in the hearts and minds of men. When the drums of war have stopped beating, when the smoke has cleared, what remains is the question for each generation. Will we continue to repeat the mistakes of the past, or learn to write a new chapter where victory is no longer measured by corpses, but by bridges connecting people to people? The stories of the past are more than dust blown away by the winds of time. They are warnings. They are mirrors in which we see ourselves. Today, you have walked with me through bloody battlefields, listening to the cheers of victory and the sighs of loss. But this journey never ends, because history always has a way of repeating itself. If we forget the lessons of yesterday, and it is our duty, of all those who love the truth, to keep these memories alive. If you believe that the past can illuminate the present, if you believe that the stories of the past still have something to teach us today, then join me on this journey. Subscribe to never miss the echoes of history. Turn on notifications so that you will be the first to hear when a new story is told. Because this is more than just a YouTube channel. This is a living history, and you are a part of it. We are the ones who write history with the choices we make today.